Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Shiur, this online Shomrei Shiur. As Pesach approaches, it's somewhat hard to believe that Pesach is indeed around the corner, 2.5 weeks from now. And many of our Pesach plans are clearly out of kilter. All of us trying to scramble and work out what we're going to do. But let us at least try to get in the mindset and forget about what's going on and focus on the Yontif and the upcoming joy and specialness of that Yontif. One of the major themes clearly of Seder night and Pesach in general, celebrating our exodus from slavery to freedom, is the theme of slavery, that we were as a Jewish people, sort of the early stages, our pre-stages of our nationhood, for centuries really, 210 years, our tradition tells us we were slaves in Egypt. What exactly does it mean to be a slave? I guess for us living now in 2020, slavery is quite a distant thing. Even if in the world at large, slavery existed, even well into the 19th century, only being put to an end really by the American Civil War in the mid-19th century. And even that slavery was probably somewhat different than the slavery of millennia past. And I don't know if you've ever read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, a really powerful autobiography about a black African-American slave who escaped his plantation in the South, made his way to the North, became a highly celebrated individual, a writer, a thinker, a leader. And I remember reading that in the university and having this sort of impact on what it was, the mindset, what it was to live in slavery. Nonetheless, for us nowadays, it's pretty distant and pretty foreign type of concept. But if we're to understand Pesach, or to understand what we're celebrating, that movement from Avdut, from slavery to Cherut, to freedom, we have to try to wrap our heads around what slavery is. And there's different ways of doing this. There's definitely a large topic and many different avenues we could think about what it is to be a slave. We could try to enter into the psychological, emotional state of a slave. We could try to study it sociologically, historically. But I think for us, perhaps the best way to understand it is halachically, through halachic frameworks, through understanding what it is to be a slave in halacha. And halacha has what to say about a slavery. It's an institution and existed, both Eved Ivri, that idea that was Jewish slaves, but that they weren't really slaves, they were more indentured servants who had to be treated with a huge amount of respect. I mean, the truth is, every slave, Jew or non-Jew, who owned by a Jew had to be treated with respect. But a Jewish slave was effectively a Jew who was sort of on a long contract, working contract, personal assistant, you might say nowadays. So what we'll focus more on is a non-Jewish slave, the idea of an Eved Kanani, that the Torah has a provision for Jews owning non-Jewish slaves. And again, a huge amount of halachic framework, a huge amount of laws pertaining to how they should be treated. But nonetheless, by seeing how halacha views such an individual and what they can and cannot to do, perhaps will give us an understanding of what it is to be a eved, what it is to be a slave, at least from the Jewish viewpoint, from the viewpoint of halacha. What I'm going to share with you this evening, the time we have together, is something based on an essay by Rav Soloveitchik. He has a book on Pesach called Festival of Freedom. I'll show up here, Festival of Freedom, a really great book with many great essays. And one of them here, he unpacks this topic of slavery a little bit at the end. Hopefully we'll get to what it is to be free, what does it mean to be free as a Jew. And he breaks it down as follows. He says there's 2 points of slavery, there's 2 elements of what it means to be a slave. On the one hand, there is the juridic political, meaning that the human person, the human body, is owned by somebody else. The entirety of that individual, his skills, his talents, doesn't belong to him, but it belongs to somebody else. But there's something actually that goes deeper than that. Beyond being owned by somebody else, your talents, your time, who you are, there's what he calls a typological or personalistic type of slave, which is a class of people who think, feel, and act in a distinct manner, and thus reflecting a peculiar personality. I mean, it goes beyond what you do, your time, your actions, but it's who you are. It goes much deeper. It's in the identity of the individual. That's a different level of slavery. If you look at the first source on the sheet, at the end of Magid, we make a blessing, we conclude Magid, and we drink the second wine. You've seen the bolded words, V'nodeh lecha shir chadash. And we thank God with this new song, Al gu'elatenu va'al pedus nafshenu, on our redemption and on the redemption of our souls. So we see here already in the text of the Haggadah, we're nodding our heads to the idea that there's two different types of emancipation. There's two levels of slavery that we've now been released from. There's gu'ulatenu, a physical redemption, Va'al pedus nafshenu, something about the soul, the personalistic element of there, that we've also had the pedus, we've been exonerated from that, we've been removed from that, again denoting that there's two levels. And again, Rambam in his Hilchos Chametz HaMatzah, his laws of Pesach, in the chapter 7, some of it we'll see later on inside, and Halacha 2, he talks about the mitzvah of telling over the story of Mitzrayim, the story of the Exodus to one's children. And we talk about the fact that on this night, Pada Utanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vayotzienu Lechirut. On this night, Pada Utanu, God emancipated us, He redeemed us, and He took us out to freedom. Again, there's two levels here. Physically leaving Egypt, we're no longer under the jurisdiction of the Egyptians, we're no longer owned by them. But there's another deeper level that somehow goes to the personality of the individual. His whole identity is tied up in his slave mentality, and that is also something we were removed from. The truth is, halacha, when it talks about a Jew owning a non-Jewish slave, recognizes these two levels, these two elements of slavery. If you look in source 2, I've brought on the source sheet, the Ramban. So Nachmanides wrote a commentary on Torah, quite a famous one, an important one. He also wrote a commentary on Gemara, on the entirety of the Talmud Bavli, on Shas. So in Kiddushin, I know the Monday night shares me learning Kiddushin. They probably have to cast their minds back a long way to go to the first chapter. The first chapter, first about 13, 14 daf, deal with the halachas of marriage, of the marriage contract, how one gets married. But then it moves on to how one owns a slave and the laws of slavery. And the Ramban there writes, therefore it appears to me, there are two types of kinyonim, of ownership when it comes to a servant. Echad kinyan mammon, one of them is a monetary ownership. V'hu kinyan demaisa yadav. That means the master owns the rights to the work and to the action and to the time of his slave. Ve'echad kinyan isur. But deeper than that is an acquisition of isur, meaning what? Shehu osra b'vas Yisrael. That this slave is not allowed to marry a Jewish woman. Upatim in mixas mitzvahs. So similarly, a slave is parta from mitzvahs. Now, a Jewish slave is chayiv in mitzvahs, has obliged with all the mitzvahs. What we're talking about is a non-Jewish slave. And really the truth is, when a Jew acquired a non-Jewish slave at Ever Kanaani, he really was a quasi-conversion. The time he acquired him, he put him through a quasi-conversion. He was a sort of a half-Jew, but he wasn't a full Jew. So, one of the elements he's not a full Jew is he cannot marry a fully Jewish woman. And the other thing is, we'll see that he's exempt from certain types of mitzvahs. Meaning, in order to release the slave from his servitude, you can't just let him go. You can't just say you're free. You actually need to write for him what equivalent of a get for a woman. Somehow it's not just I own you like I own a car or I own other possessions. There's a much deeper, a much more profound sense and level of ownership that goes into the root of his personality, into the root of his rights as an individual. So again, we see it reflected in halacha, these two elements of what it means to be a slave, which is of course true on a national level. When we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, it wasn't only that we were slaves, that we were stuck serving Pharaoh and the Egyptian economy with our time, with our energies, with our resources, but perhaps it also touched on a deeper element, which we'll see reflects in three different areas. The fact that there's a kinyan isur, the fact that a slave isn't just obliged to work for his master and use the time and talent, but is also somehow his personality, his identity is tied up in that identity of slavery, have three ramifications. Ramification number one is, we just saw, that the slave is exempt from mitzvahs asesha hazman groma. Like we know by a woman, which is very different from a woman, as we'll see. She's not obliged to to fulfill those time-bound mitzvahs. We encourage women to. They can make a bracha. If they do it, it's equal and akin to a man doing it, but they're not fundamentally obliged to do it in the same way as a man. So to a slave, a Kanani, a non-Jewish slave working for a Jew who's gone through this quasi-conversion but not yet fully a Jew, he's also potter, he's also be exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, and even if he wants to do them, he can do them, but they have no sort of effect, they have no meaning, and he cannot make a blessing on them. Number two is, as we saw in the Ramban, the Nachmanides, that this Kanani, a slave, is excluded from matrimony. He cannot marry. And thirdly, he's disqualified from bearing witness. Such a person, a slave, cannot be a witness both in a civil and a criminal court. And by deconstructing and trying to understand why in these three areas, time-bound mitzvahs, why they're exempt, by marriage, why a slave cannot marry, and why a slave cannot give witness testimony, we'll better understand what it is, the mindset, what it is, the psychology, what it means religiously to be a slave, and perhaps therefore by understand what it is, that movement from the Egyptian slavery to freedom. So Soloveitchik writes that basically the reason why a slave cannot give testimony, even though he may have witnessed the event, he may be the only witness, nonetheless, his testimony is not accepted in the court of Jewish law, is because we don't trust the slave personality. And it's not about the individual. He may be a very trustworthy individual. It may well be that the master trusts him with everything he has. He'll give him rulership over his entire household, like we see with Yosef in Egypt, in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar literally gave Yosef the entire reins over his house. It's not about the personal slave, but it's about a group of slaves. And why is that, says Rosh Soloveitchik? Is because a slave has a distortion of reality. A slave is a person who is without options, meaning the greatness of our humanity, of what it means to be a human being, is to be able to choose freely. It's our dignity and our creativity, meaning we have options in life. We can choose to do this, we can choose to do that. And that's what really makes us who we are. A slave, on the other hand, is never really confronted with alternatives, with options in life. Every waking moment, every aspect of his day and of his life is controlled and ordained by his master, by a higher being. He has all his decisions made for him. And thereby, he has no ability, and he also has no incentive to seize initiative. We, as free-choosing human beings, hopefully choose to better our situation, to intervene in our life when we see our life going off course, when things are going astray, and we can change the course of things. We can put things better because it makes sense for us to put things better, because it's within our grips to attain for ourselves a better future. The slave has no such option. What's going to be tomorrow and the next week and the next year is not really at his behest. It's not really his choice. He's at the behest of his master, and therefore he seizes no initiative to make himself better, to improve his situation. And someone who has no incentive to improve their situation, for instance, this is documented about people in concentration camps or in prisons, for instance. You start to be delusional, meaning you start to see things in a distorted way, and you start to see things in a way that suits you. If you're unable to practically make a difference in your life, you're unable really to extricate yourself from this situation, the only way to deal with it psychologically is to make believe that the situation is different than it really is. And to have testimony, to be able to come to a court of law and give trustworthy testimony, we have to believe, we have to have the sense that you're telling the truth, that you see the world as everyone else sees it, that you see it in the right mindset. And therefore a slave has this distortion, therefore his testimony is not good testimony. The other reason Rav Soloveitchik offers why it is that a slave cannot give testimony is based on the comment on the Ibn Ezra. Again, in the sheet I've shared with you, source 3. Then Ibn Ezra asks a fascinating question, and it's a question we should all have when we read the story of the Exodus. The Jews are leaving Egypt, they're at the Yam Suf, and they're being chased by the Egyptians. And we're told they're panicked, they're panic-stricken. They turn to Moshe and they say, there are not enough graves in Egypt, that you brought us out to the Yam Suf, to the Red Sea, that we're going to die here at the hands of the Egyptians. But the verses tell us there were 600,000 male Jews between the ages of 20 and 60, really army-ready Jews. On the other hand, there were 600 chariots, Egyptian chariots. Yes, they may have been the Sayet Mankal, the top the top group in the Egyptian army, but nonetheless it was 600 versus 600,000. So why were the Jews panicked? Why were they scared? They could easily outnumber and defeat the Egyptians by simply flooding them with the 600,000 men to overcome the 600 chariots. That's the Ibn Ezra's question here. Why was it? An encampment of 600,000 men was scared of those people chasing after them. Why didn't they fight back? The answer is that the Egyptians were the masters over the Jews. This generation now that were the ones to leave Egypt, they had been inculcated from the day they were born. Their lives were those of slaves living under the dominion and jurisdiction of the Egyptians. It was a mindset that they had. We are the underdogs, we are the slaves, and they are our masters. So how now? Overnight, yes, they may have got their freedom from God, but how overnight? You don't just change the mindset overnight, but now they'll feel that they're going to fight back. Obviously, the Nazis understood this with their propaganda, with everything that preceded the final solution, instilling a certain mindset, a certain, perhaps it even inculcated inside the victim's mindset that you don't fight back. Not because you can't, you may well win in terms of the strategies of war, but you cannot fight back because you don't have the mindset to fight back. You see yourself as the underdog. You see yourself as a slave in front of their master. So too said Soloveitchik, that is why it is that a slave cannot give testimony. A slave is a person who is always fearful, and therefore he's unwilling to contradict anyone. He's unwilling to antagonize even a stranger. And as unjustified as his fear may be, it's a motivating factor in his entire life. He has a slave mentality. He lives with a master over him at all times, and therefore he's fearful of others, and he's unwilling to contradict others. We'll skip the next source for a matter of time. But again, that's what the tochacha, the rebukes, the curses in the end of the book of Devarim, describing the situation the Jews will find themselves in. It describes the fear that will grip us. And it's not necessarily a rational or even a reasonable fear. It's not a fear from any actual danger, but rather it's a fear from the thought of danger. It's unfounded. It's based on an imagined fear rather than a real threat. And that's why a slave, he's unwilling to contradict anyone, therefore he cannot stand up and he can't give testimony in a court of law. Meaning you have to be fearless in order to give testimony. You can't think, well, if I say this, the minute I get out of court, what will the person do to me that I've given testimony against? You have to have a certain sense of conviction and of trust in yourself and in your own abilities. It's interesting, that's perhaps why Seder, the idea of leaning at the Seder night is such a central part of our Seder experience. Because what is leaning? Leaning is taking that rigid, upright posture, the type of posture one would have in front of someone they respect, and it's relaxing, it's leaning out, it's being our own person, irrelevant of what anyone else thinks, what anyone else there in our presence. And that's exactly the reason why a student at Talmud is not allowed to lean in front of their Rebbe, in front of their teacher without permission. Because leaning contradicts. Leaning is exactly the type of behavior that's not allowed in front of someone you respect. And therefore, that's why leaning is part of the Seder experience, because Haseba, leaning means to find exactly the very thing that a slave doesn't have. We move from slavery to freedom on Seder night. We show that, we demonstrate that with Haseba, with leaning, by showing we're not scared of anyone. We are comfortable with who we are and what we are, and we don't have to have always on the top of our head the thought of what will other people do, what will my master say, am I allowed to behave in this specific way? So that's why a slave cannot give testimony. The second halachic category we said that defines what it is to be a slave is they're exempt from mitzvahs aseh man groma, from time-bound mitzvahs. And why is that? In one line, because a slave lacks time experience. While everything exists in time, meaning all things in this world, from all levels of creation, the inanimate, animate objects, the living beings, the animal kingdom, everything exists in time, but only human beings are capable of experiencing time. Meaning many people live time. Sorry, many things or many people live in time, but not everybody actually lives time. And there's three components to time awareness, time consciousness. On the one hand, it's the ability to be retrospective, to understand there's a past, we come from somewhere. It's the exploration of things yet unborn, meaning anticipation of the future. To be time aware means I live with an awareness of the future. And third is an appreciation of the present moment being the one which is the most precious. So meaning history is one thing, but we know as Jews, we have a collective memory. A memory is different than history. History is regurgitating or bringing up the past and studying the things in the past. Bringing the past. On the other hand, memory is the ability to relive and recover and reproduce those past experiences. So that's exactly what Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is. In each and every generation, each and every year, when we sit down to the table on Seder night, we're not just telling over a story that once was, as the Rambam writes, as we say even in the Haggadah, we're trying to relive it. We're trying to use that memory, that collective memory, that memories which have been passed on from generation to generation, to somehow bring that past alive as if we ourselves were exiting Egypt. Secondly, to have time consciousness, to be a time-aware person, to live time, is to be committed to the future. That always means to be a free-choosing being, as we described just above. That as a free-choosing being, that means we can affect the future. That the future isn't just something that's unknown, or it is unknown, but it's not just something that will happen, that's out there. It's something we can be a part of, and that we've got a responsibility towards shaping it. And hence the Haggadah, which begins, the whole of Magid is describing past events. When we get to Nirtzah, when we get to the end of the Haggadah, it's a vision of a redeemed future, of the eschatological age, about Yemos HaMashiach, because that is what it means to be a time-aware person. We start in the past, we're living it here today, but it's all for the purpose of building a future ahead of us. And thirdly, for the time-awareness person, is the ability to connect those past and the future in the present, and to realize that in the present exists eternity. And Judaism has always been sensitive to time and to the exactness of time. Halach is all about Shabbos goes out at whatever it is, 7:01, a minute before was Shabbos, and the minute after isn't Shabbos. It's about seizing the moment. You know, King Shaul was told by Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet, that after he didn't exterminate the entirety of the people of Amalek, that he'd sinned against God, and God wasn't happy with him. But yeah, Shaul doesn't seize the opportunity like King David does when he's confronted by Nathan the prophet that he's made a mistake, and he confesses immediately. King Shaul tries to push the Samuel the prophet off, saying, I really did. He makes excuses for himself. And it's only after the point when this prophet tells him that God's no longer willing to forgive, and that because of this sin, you're going to lose the monarchy, that's when Shaul tries to gain forgiveness. But the moment has been lost, the opportunity has gone, he's missed the chance, and indeed, as we know, his monarchy lasts a few years, it doesn't pass over to his children. Again, accentuating, stressing the time consciousness, the pressure of time, the exactitude of time in Judaism. A slave has none of this. A slave has no time awareness. Because as a free person and a free choosing person, we live with a very deep sense of time, of the past, definitely of the future because we have the ability to fashion it, and even of the present because I can choose what to do and how to make the most of this opportunity. A slave whose time is his master's, who has no control over his own time, for him life is motionless. For him time has no meaning, and therefore he's exempt from time-bound mitzvahs. Any mitzvah which isn't divorced from time, but enters into the realm of time, which is specific to time, which only carries meaning because it's carried out within a specific time and it's attached to a historical or timely event, for such an individual, there's no chiyuv, there's no obligation to keep those mitzvahs because he's divorced from time. And finally, the third element we said a slave in halacha is different is his inability to marry. Because the Torah doesn't see marriage as just some utilitarian convention that two people get together, build a life, and it's better than one. But marriage is really coming together. It's a metaphysical and existential community. To marry, in the deeper sense, means to break down the barriers of individuality, of our own ego, and to be able to share that with someone else. The marriage is the most basic building blocks of a community. And therefore a slave who only thinks of himself, because a slave is only ever thinking, how can I get out of this? How can I extricate myself? How can I free myself? He's only ever thinking, what's in it for me? How can I make my own life and my own predicament bearable, manageable, perhaps better in the future? He has no ability, he has no headspace to think for others. He has no ability to reach out beyond himself, to break down those barriers, and to really truly be there for somebody else, and to create a deep, lasting, meaningful relationship with somebody else. And hence, a slave cannot get married. He's unable. The whole mindset, what it is to be a slave, is contradictory. It cannot be squared with the notion of what it is to be married. And that's interesting. Carbon Pesach, the central carbon, the central motif of Seder night, is unique as a carbon that was brought as a group. We're told that Sela Beis always Sela Bayis. When the Torah commands us to bring the Paschal Lamb, it's all about bringing it as groups. Other sacrifices were all brought individually. When it came to the Carbon Pesach, it was specifically brought what's called a chabura, as a group of families coming together, because that's what Pesach is all about. On Pesach, when we moved out of slavery to freedom, when we moved out from that mindset of being slaves, that only thinking about ourselves, on our own future, our own well-being, and we are now free people who could break down barriers and therefore extend ourselves to others. Pesach's all about the feeling of Jewish solidarity. And that's why we begin the Haggadah with Halach Ma'anya, that statement, that invitation, Kol ditzrich yesei v'yechol, anyone who needs, come and eat. Kol ditzrich yesei v'yiftach, anyone who requires, come and join our Korban Pesach. And why this double invitation? Because there's two levels here. On the one hand, it's Kol ditzrich and Kol dichsven, meaning there's people who are literally in need of charity, in need of the food, of what we have to offer them. But there's also people who may live in huge mansions and have all the money in the world, but they still need that sense of brotherhood, that sense of reaching out, because they may have everything physically, but they're lacking that sense of togetherness, they're lacking that sense of emotional shared history and shared future. And that's again indicative. That's part of what prescriptive of what it means to be a slave, is an inability to think to think about others, that we move on, that we've moved out of when we move on Seder. I know I'm conscious the time is going on, so we'll leave the rest of the sources which talk about what it is to be a free person. But at least I think we've seen on these three elements in halacha defines what it is to be a slave, what slavery is. A person cannot marry, a person cannot give testimony, and a person cannot marry, because they're not just prescriptive halachas, but they go to the root of what it is to have a slave mentality. And by understanding, perhaps, we've seen what it is to be a slave, and what it means on a personalistic level, not just on a juristic level, on a personalistic level, meaning it goes to our core, goes to our identity, how we relate to others, how we relate to time, and how we relate to ourselves, how we really relate to the world, and our mindset to it. Hopefully, when we celebrate on Pesach that past history of being slaves, and now we enjoy our freedom, hopefully we can appreciate it at a little deeper level, what it is to be a free person, and to utilize those three areas, to utilize our ability to think about others, to reach out, to connect to others, our ability to be the destinies of our own future, to be masters of our own time. And thirdly, that ability to give testimony in a court of law, i.e. the ability to live without fear, that we live without fear of what others will think and what others will say about us. We can speak our minds, we can be true to who we are, and finally, we can also be trustworthy. That indeed we have that dignity, we are trustworthy in who we are and what we say. It will stop for now. Anyone wants to ask questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes.